Jazz wasn't a specific genre in the 20s, 30s, or even the 1940s in New Zealand. I always like to say that jazz was a verb and an adjective. It wasn't a genre. So there was no set repertoire. You could jazz anything.
Jazz it up, you mean?
You literally jazz it up. And you have these things called jazz effects. So that in the 1920s, that's things like the talking mute sounds, it's improvisation, it's swing rhythm, all those different sorts of things. Those are the jazz effects to make any music jazz.
Welcome to the Research and Reason podcast. Join us as we discuss the latest research, news and opinion from academics in the Faculty of Arts and Education at the University of Auckland.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Julianne Evans tōku ingoa. I'm Julianne Evans, the Media Advisor for the Faculty of Arts and Education, and I'm talking today to Dr. Aleisha Ward, a professional teaching fellow in the School of Music, who specialises in the history of jazz in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Tēnā koe, Aleisha. Lovely to have you here.
Kia ora, Julianne. Thank you for having me.
I'm very fascinated with your subject, jazz in New Zealand. Mm-hmm. I believe you're actually currently writing a history of what you refer to as the long jazz age between 1917 and 1935. And I just want to start by saying that I think a lot of us, probably me included, wouldn't have thought that jazz was a thing necessarily in New Zealand, certainly at that time. I mean, you know, many of us enjoy jazz now, and I'm definitely one of those people. But I was surprised when I saw that time period. And I couldn't even name you one of the artists. So go for it. Tell us all about jazz in New Zealand at that time.
Well, so jazz came to New Zealand right at the end of World War I, and that's when it was spreading all around the world. So what I find fascinating about this period is how jazz came to be here and what jazz meant to the people in New Zealand at that time. So jazz came via a whole variety of mediums. So people, obviously, you've got people coming back from the war fronts in World War I. In 1917, James Reese Europe was performing in Paris with his Harlem Hellfighters band, which was part of one of the African-American battalions. And so any serviceman that ended up in Paris at the end of World War I, and there were a lot of them that ended up in Paris at the end of World War I, would have heard this band. And same goes for going over to London. There were all these little quasi-jazz. I say quasi-jazz because this is the period where it's really moving from what was then ragtime into what became jazz. All these bands that are coming out of the United States, they're playing in London, they're playing in Paris, they're playing in Cairo, and all of these people coming back from the war fronts, they're in these places for rest and rehabilitation. They've been discharged from the service and so on, and they're hearing these bands. They're going to dances because obviously, like, you're a soldier on the trenches. The first thing you want to do when you get back to civilization after having a bath is
have some fun.
To have some fun, to go out on a date with a girl, to go dancing, to listen to music.
To forget the horrible things you've just had to experience.
Yeah. So it came back with the people, servicemen, and of course servicewomen, the volunteers who were nurses and ambulance drivers and everything who served overseas. It came back via sheet music as well as stories. And then it just started spreading because 1917 is also when we have the first official recordings of jazz by the original Dixieland Jazz Band in the US. That occurs at the start of 1917, in February 1917. And so there are now recordings of jazz, and gramophones are becoming very popular and very accessible and relatively reasonably priced. They're still pretty expensive, but they're accessible to the middle class now, and they're the new tech toy. It's like getting the latest iPhone or something. So it's starting to move through technology as well. And then into the early 1920s, we also have the revival of the vaudeville circuits. So they kind of stopped during World War One.
This is in New Zealand?
This is around the world.
Right.
So the vaudeville circuit was global. It was there were a few different circuits, but the one that came through New Zealand was called the Red Line, and it was literally global. It started in Britain. It went right across Europe, through the Middle East, through India, Asia, down through Southeast Asia, around Australia, around New Zealand, and then it would return itself, basically. Some of these vaudeville acts also came from the United States on a separate circuit. So it's a big circuit. Vaudeville acts on these circuits, if they did the whole circuit, it was generally a 3 to 4 year commitment.
Gosh, it would have been quite tiring.
Yeah. And of course, this is long before air travel, so everything is by train and by ship. So we have these vaudeville acts coming out of Britain, coming out of the US, touring around Australia and New Zealand. We were essentially an adjunct to the Australian circuit. But even just doing Australia and New Zealand was an 18-month commitment.
Gosh.
Yeah.
And where were they performing? In town halls?
They were performing in the theatres. So where Smith & Coe's is nowadays used to be the Auckland Opera House.
On Queen Street?
Yep. Yeah. So it was sort of the back end of Smith & Co. So facing on to Elliott Street. That was the Auckland Opera House, and that had been there since the 1800s. And it was along with His Majesty's further down on Queen Street.
You're sadly not there anymore.
Yeah, exactly. Was, one of the two big theatres in the central city for vaudeville in particular. And Fuller's Vaudeville Company, as in, yes, the Fuller's Ferries. It is that same company. Is the Fuller's Ferries are just a different branch of that company. That they had the Opera House, and J.C. Williamson and Co. had Majesties as well. And they were rivals, but there was a lot of crossover between the artists, and the artists generally played on both of those circuits. So the Opera House and His Majesty's were there really from the late 1800s, and they were very popular in the 1910s, 1920s. The Opera House burned down in 1926. Yeah, and that is where the St. James comes from.
Oh.
Because the owners of the Opera House, they didn't want to rebuild on the Opera House site. So they purchased the lot where St. James is and built the St. James.
Gosh. And for those who don't know, that's a lovely theatre that's in disrepair at the moment, that's in the city of Auckland on the main street of Queen Street, hopefully going to be rebuilt. Yeah.
Yeah, and of course the Civic Theatre, our big, beautiful Art Deco atmospheric theatre that was built in 1929. So you've got a lot of these theatres popping up.
And these big acts coming along.
And some unknown acts as well, but some very, very good musicians. One of the earliest acts on the vaudeville jazz acts on the vaudeville circuit here was a trio of sisters, the Tully sisters, and they did jazz as music, jazz as dance, and jazz as comedy, because jazz isn't just music in this period in time either. It's a whole variety of things.
I didn't know that. What kind of songs were they doing? Did they have an orchestra with them, or a small ensemble?
It kind of depended. So some of these are bands, so 3, 4, 5, 6 or bigger bands, and so they're a self-contained act. Some solo artists who use the theatre orchestra as their backing, and the theatre orchestras, by the way, is where the first jazz musicians in New Zealand came from. So
and all around the country?
Pretty much, yeah. So the very first jazz band in New Zealand came from Auckland, and that was the Bob Adams Jazz Band. And Bob Adams was a percussionist at the Opera House from age 15. So this was around 1915-ish onwards. And so he was literally on the spot when the first jazz artists came to perform on stages in New Zealand. And he really enjoyed this music, and he thought, hey, I can play this music. And that's where the local jazz scene starts as well.
And were they paid? They were paid professional
Oh yes, these
musicians.
are paid professional
Yeah.
musicians.
Yeah.
Yeah, quite well paid.
Were they?
So with the vaudeville artists, the ones that are going on the circuit, obviously all their travel and accommodation is provided for them for the length of their contract, and they get a per diem, so a per day payment for their services. And they'd be performing anywhere between 1 and 4 times a day. So on a Saturday, for example, where you have the big vaudeville shows, they would start at 10 a.m. in the morning and they'd go through to midnight. And then a show could be 2 hours long. But generally the acts would just like circle through out the day.
So you could come and catch them at any stage.
Yeah, exactly. So you can go to, we want to go to the vaudeville in the morning or the afternoon or in the evening or somewhere in between. And you just stayed for as long as you wanted. This is, of course, in addition to the revue style acts and shows, which are kind of the predecessors of our modern musicals.
And did people dance, or did they sit quietly in their seats?
So this is really interesting because when you had a jazz dance act or any dance act, so sometimes they're demonstrative. They're demonstrating the latest dances. So think of people like Vernon and Irene Castle out of the US. They didn't actually ever perform here, but they were a dance duo who propagated a lot of modern, what we now know as social dances, things like the foxtrot, the quick step. Those were originally jazz dances. The quick step was originally called the jazz foxtrot, in fact. So dance acts like that would demonstrate them. And then they'd usually advertise that they're going to give some lessons as well. Some of them were participatory, as in they're demonstrating the latest jazz dance and they're then encouraging the audience to get up and try it.
How fun.
Yeah. Yeah.
Really fun.
And this is, while this is stage dance rather than social dance for the most part, it does translate onto the social dance floor as well. And jazz becomes really known as a dance music in New Zealand, particularly in the 20s and the 30s. It's not until after World War II that it becomes a music specifically to listen to.
I don't think many people would know that at all. They wouldn't. I think people think jazz is the kind of thing where you sit and listen.
Nowadays, yes.
Almost, in a very avid way to this music. But so that was the 20s, and then it evolved because then what historically was going on here was the Depression, I suppose, 1930s, and jazz continued on, I suppose.
Yes. Absolutely.
And how did it evolve?
So in the 20s, you have the initial style of jazz, what we now call the New Orleans style or the Dixieland style of jazz. And so it's evolving throughout the 1920s. We're getting, some of us is actually still coming from the vaudeville stage, so you're getting the virtuoso style, which if you think of people like Louis Armstrong and his trumpet work in the 1920s, that's the real virtuoso style. It's big, it's flamboyant, it's showing off your technique.
One particular person's on display.
Exactly. And then you have the what becomes the social dance style as well. And it's really important to know that jazz wasn't a specific genre in the 20s, 30s, or even the 1940s in New Zealand. I always like to say that jazz was a verb and an adjective. It wasn't a genre. So there was no set repertoire. You could jazz anything.
Or jazz it up, you mean?
You literally jazz it up. And you have these things called jazz effects. So that in the 1920s, that's things like the talking mute sounds, it's improvisation, it's swing rhythm, all those different sorts of things. Those are the jazz effects to make any music jazz. So you jazzed a piece of music, and so it could be light classical, it could be another popular song, it could be something out of vaudeville and musical theatre. A lot of the early repertoire, actually a lot of the standard repertoire even these days in jazz, comes out of what is called Tin Pan Alley. So that was in the US and New York, and that was the literal street where all the songwriters basically had their studios writing music for Broadway. And a lot of those early songs, like by the Gershwins, by Fats Waller, who was also a jazz musician, but he did compose for Broadway. That's where they were based. That's where they were writing music for these musical reviews and early musical theatre. And so a lot of that music became later standard repertoire for jazz. But in the 20s and even into the 1930s, some of that came through, some of it didn't. Getting jazz here was like really messy, like lots of mediations. Sometimes it took no time at all. Sometimes it took loads of time. It's coming from like radio. It's coming from records. It's coming through sheet music. It's coming through bands on the steamers and things like that. So it's really quite messy how it got here and when individual bits got here. So for New Zealand artists, they were just taking any music that they like. Most of them are performing for social dance. So there are some strictures for that. So firstly, you want some nice tempos. The dancers will complain if you don't give them nice tempos.
So people came to a dance and they were the performers.
And they were the performers.
Yeah.
So they were the dance band. And a lot of the time you see dance band and jazz band being synonymous in New Zealand. And so they're choosing any sort of music, putting it at a tempo. Sometimes they're changing things to make it into a foxtrot sort of vibe or a waltz vibe, or then, of course, later on the Charleston. It's like that's the 1 and the 2 step types of vibes. So you want a particular tempo. You don't want it too slow. You don't want it too fast. You want something that's got a good beat to it because, again, dancers, they like a good beat. And whilst you're improvising, you can't go off into the stratosphere. You can't be the virtuoso. You've got to keep your solos short, generally about 4 to 8 bars, sometimes a bit longer. It has to remain within the tempo and the beat of what you're playing for whatever dance it is you're playing. And you can't do things like rubatos going really slow and then really fast and then really slow and really fast.
Right.
Because the dancers will get annoyed and then the management will get annoyed and you won't get another gig.
And you need the money.
And you'd like the money because young people in the 20s and 30s, particularly in the 1930s during the Great Depression, could earn a livable wage just from performing.
Great.
Yeah.
And did the people who who went along to it, were they young people or were they everybody? I mean, was there how when rock and roll came along and all those other things, there was a group of people that said, oh, society's going to hell in a handbasket.
Yep.
This new music, we don't like it. Was jazz, I mean, I suppose because it's so, there's so much of it and it's so many different ways, but was it ever disapproved of as a type of music in this country?
I always say long before there was sex, drugs and rock and roll, there was sex, drugs and jazz. So the New Zealand Truth, our wonderful tabloid, has so many articles about young people, particularly young women, being taken off the right path by jazz. And they're falling into drugs and alcohol and premarital sex because of jazz. The flappers, everything that was wrong in the world because of the flappers, because of jazz. On the other hand, they also wrote articles about the flappers in particular as being young, confident, modern women who they have a job, they've
got money to spend.
But they're supporting their family. So we're not abrogating the feminine obligations to the family.
Oh,
as
you
well.
mean these about the performers or about the audience?
The audience, the young ladies are dancing. Interestingly, we don't see anything negative about female performers in this time, and there were a lot of them. In the 20s and the 30s, probably a third of jazz musicians in New Zealand were women. Many were band leaders as well.
That's interesting.
Down in Christchurch, there was a Miss McDonald whose first name never appears in print, so I can't tell you anything really about her. But she had several bands in Christchurch, and she played a lot of the very high-end dances at like the Art Gallery, the Winter Garden, which was the premier jazz venue in Christchurch, the Town Hall for like the big balls. As well as doing more middle sort of level gigs and things like that. And she was, as a pianist, she also was accompanying other people, like accompanying soloists and the recital stage and things like that. So there are a lot of women playing jazz, particularly in the 20s, 30s and 40s, particularly in the 1940s during World War II.
And playing a lot of instruments?
Playing a lot of instruments, yeah. So two of Walter Smith, who was one of our earliest jazz band leaders here in Auckland. Two of his nieces, Dinah and Marjorie, were in a lot of his bands. They were in also other bands, and they had very, very good professional performing careers. They were multi-instrumentalists. Let's see if I can remember which instruments go with which girl. So Dinah played violin, banjo, and the C saxophone, which is kind of between an alto saxophone and a soprano saxophone. And Marjorie played alto saxophone, clarinet, and string instrument. I think she might have played guitar.
Gosh, that's very varied. Was the music something that captured the imagination of Māori here as well?
Yes.
I'm assuming it might have done.
Yeah, Walter Smith was Maori, so he's one of our earliest ones. He's a fascinating person. So he was older in the 1920s. So he was born in 1880, and he spent most of his childhood not in New Zealand but in Utah, in the US, because his family were Mormon missionaries. And so he went with an aunt to Utah at age 10, and he stayed there for 15 years. He actually went to Brigham Young University to study music there, and then he started performing music on the US vaudeville circuit, playing Hawaiian music, which was a big craze in the 1910s. He comes back to New Zealand in 1913-ish to work at the Maori Agricultural College down, I think it's South Hawke's Bay, and he's a music teacher there, and he's teaching these young men the latest music styles, so a lot of ragtime at that point. He comes up to Auckland in 1920, and then he starts teaching up here. He starts organising bands up here. He had a whole stable of bands, and he had everything from jazz bands. He performed on the radio and in cabarets through to, I kid you not, a mandolin orchestra.
Wow.
Yeah, so all different types of ranges of mandolin. So you can have like bass mandolin and contrabass mandolin and things like that, and like soprano end mandolins. This mandolin orchestra was about 15 people. So it's a real orchestra, and he has all sorts of ensembles in between. He becomes one of our best-known music teachers in the city, a strong proponent and supporter of women as being performing musicians and women performing jazz, as witnessed by the fact that his two nieces played in a band with him, and they both had very successful performing careers. He also mentored another woman band leader, Elsie Nixon. She became the band leader of the Melody Maids, who were our first all-girl jazz band in the late 1920s.
So for your book, I imagine you're looking for quite old images to go with it. Have you had any trouble finding them?
Actually, no, because Dennis Huggard, who was an avid jazz historian and collector of jazz ephemera, created a massive, truly massive collection that now lives at the Alexander Turnbull Library in Wellington. So a lot of the images that I have found come from his collection specifically. So he, for about 55, maybe 60 years, he was actively collecting jazz materials, and he was able to get hold of a lot of original photographs of these bands, and he was able to identify a lot of these people.
How fantastic for you.
Yeah. So this material went to the Turnbull right at the start of my PhD. So it was nice and neatly catalogued, and I could spend loads and loads of time rather than going to Dennis's own house and having to spend time in his basement looking through his collection. So it was quite useful that he donated it at that point.
Well, he must be delighted that you're doing it.
He was, yeah.
As he passed away.
He passed away in 2016. 2015, 2016. I can't quite recall off the top of my head. But no, he certainly knew about my research. I interviewed him for my research. We had a number of fascinating conversations about his activities as a jazz collector and historian. And he was fascinated to see how I put everything together. And he was very enthusiastic about the end product and the thesis, even if he said it's a little hard going to read because, of course, it's academic writing.
Yeah. And so are you basing your book on your thesis? Is that
it's based
working?
partly in my thesis. So my thesis is 1920 to 1955. But I really each part of the book really could be a separate book in and of itself. So I didn't want to just do thesis turned into a book. I don't really like that idea. So I decided, well, let's start with the Jazz Age because nobody knows about it. Everyone thinks New Zealand closed at 5, that there wasn't any sort of nightlife, and yet here are all these theatres and cabarets and dance halls.
And it's so lively.
7 nights a week. Not even Sunday night was exempt from entertainment, and there's all these supper clubs that are open until 3 or 4 in the morning. There are hairdressers and tailors that are open until 10 p.m. at night, so in case you need a quick stitch up or you need to have your hair redone before going out at 8 p.m. or so.
What about the liquor laws? Were they an
well,
issue?
yes and no.
Yeah.
So, yes, technically all of these venues at that point in time were dry. You couldn't have liquor outside of hotels and restaurants and outside of certain hours and things like that. So, yes, all the cabarets were dry. Did that stop people from bringing alcohol
I'm sure it didn't.
in? Absolutely not.
No.
So there were specific garter belts that were created for ladies to hold bottles, like a bottle of wine or a bottle of champagne, bottle of gin even, in their garter belt under their dresses. And you could rent a glass at a cabaret for your bring your own type of beverage.
Orange juice?
Orange juice, absolutely. We'll go with orange juice.
Oh, how fascinating. I could keep on talking about this for ages because I'm so interested in it. But just zipping up to the present time, because I know that you specialise in that era, but that you're very knowledgeable altogether. For the person who might be listening thinking, I don't know anything about jazz in New Zealand at all, but I might like to learn a bit, where would you suggest they start?
There's so many places to start, and some of it really comes down to what sort of things you like to listen to. So if you're into sort of the 90s fusion, hip-hop, dance type of music, you might want to start with people like Mark de Clive Lowe and Nathan Haynes and who else? Jason Jones. They were our young lions at that point in time. And there's a lot of jazz fusion type of music going on there. If you're really into jazz rock, Earth, Wind and Fire, Chicago, those types of bands, you want to start with Dr. Tree. They were our one and only true jazz rock band in the 1970s, and the members of that band all have much more conventional jazz careers outside of that as well. But they're a good place to start with, and you can explore the individual artists' music after that. There's also the Quincy Conserve from the 1970s.
I remember them.
Yeah, so they're more rock with a touch of jazz, but they had people like trombonist Roger Fox in their membership.
Fantastic leader of a big band in this country.
Absolutely. So if you
sadly died.
Yeah. So if you want to get into big band music, obviously you start with Roger Fox. He was like one of the main big band leaders in New Zealand. But there's also Stuart Buchanan from Christchurch. He had a massive big band for about 50 years down in Christchurch. He has also sadly recently passed away. But there were recordings of his bands in various iterations right into the late 2010s. So I think the last one's around 2016, 2017 that the Stuart Buchanan Big Band recorded.
Fantastic. And people can see some of these ideas in the notes for the podcast as well. And finally, Aleisha, just a difficult question, I know, but if you were on a desert island and you had to choose a song to listen to or a jazz artist to listen to, above all others. Would there be one?
Oh, it would be hard to put one in. It
Or
really
a few.
would.
Give us a few.
Okay. I mean, I'll just stick with New Zealand artists because,
That's what it's about.
Exactly. So Nathan Haynes, I was a teenager when Nathan Haynes was coming through, so he was my first real introduction to jazz in New Zealand.
And he's multi-talented.
He's
and faceted,
multi-talented, exactly.
His main instrument is
Saxophone,
isn't it?
Yeah. Wellington band The Jack. I really love their music, and I'm friends with their bass player, Nick Tipping, so it's kind of a friends thing, but they are a really amazing band. Third artist would probably be Phil Broadhurst. He was a wonderful jazz pianist, and he was also a mentor of mine.
Fantastic. Do you play piano yourself?
No, actually, I don't. I play flute. I'm a jazz flutist.
Oh, how lovely. Fantastic. Look, thank you so much. And we're going to look forward to seeing that book come out. Have you any idea when it might arrive?
No, I've got to get a publisher yet.
Okay.
So any publishers listening to this, get in touch with me.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the Research and Reason podcast. Stay up to date with the Faculty of Arts and Education by following us on social media.